Millionaire announces the waitress will play the piano during a lavish party to humiliate her. What happens next makes him leave his own party. Ella adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform as she stood near the entrance of the grand mansion. She'd worked plenty of parties in her time, but none quite like those at Ethan Williams' estate. The mansion loomed behind her like a symbol of everything she didn't have: polished marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and wealth that seemed endless. For Ethan, these lavish events were more than social gatherings. They were a stage, and his guests were his audience, where he could put on a show that masked the bitterness he'd grown to embrace since his wife's death. She'd heard the stories from the other servants. How Ethan had been a good man once, how his parties had been filled with laughter and warmth. But that was before Evelyn passed. Now his eyes were cold, and he took perverse pleasure in picking apart anyone who crossed his path, especially those who couldn't fight back. Ella had no choice but to keep coming back. The pay was too good to pass up, even though working these events meant enduring the condescending looks from the guests and the occasional cruel comment from the host himself. As a single mother, every dollar counted. Her son Michael, now 6, was her world, and she'd sacrifice any pride she had left to make sure he had what he needed: clothes, food, and maybe a chance at a better life than the one she'd been handed. Tonight, the air inside the mansion was thick with perfume and wealth. The partygoers sipped champagne from crystal glasses, their conversations a hum of low voices and laughter. Ella moved between them with practiced ease, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres with a smile she didn't feel. She had become invisible in these spaces. Just another uniform, another pair of hands. As she made her way across the room, she noticed the piano in the far corner of the grand hall. It was a beautiful instrument, polished to a gleam, the kind of thing she could only dream of owning one day. Music had once been a part of her life, before Michael, before everything fell apart. She'd taken lessons as a child, and the piano had been her escape, the one thing that made her feel like she belonged to something bigger than the small life she'd known. Without thinking, she found herself staring at it, the familiar longing rising up in her chest. It had been years since she touched a piano, since she let herself feel the music the way she used to. A quiet sigh escaped her lips as her fingers brushed the edge of her tray. "Do you like the piano?" The voice snapped her out of her reverie. She turned quickly, her heart jumping into her throat. Ethan stood behind her, a glass of whiskey in hand, his sharp eyes watching her closely. She hadn't heard him approach, and now she wished she could disappear into the floor. I'm sorry, sir," Ella stammered, lowering her gaze. She'd broken one of the unwritten rules. Staff didn't make conversation with the host unless spoken to, and even then, it was dangerous territory. "It's a beautiful instrument." For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something darker, more complex. Then his lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth but edged with venom. "My late wife used to play it. She had quite the talent, but that's over now, of course." His gaze sharpened, and Ella felt a chill run down her spine. "You should remember your place here. Servers don't get to admire things they'll never touch." The room seemed to tilt, her face burning with shame. She wanted to apologize again, to say something that would make him leave her alone, but her voice felt stuck. She could feel the eyes of the other staff on her, a few guests glancing over with mild interest at the scene unfolding. Ethan didn't give her a chance to respond. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, humiliated and small. That was her first encounter with him, and it had set the tone for all the others. After that night, Ella made it a point to stay out of his line of sight, to keep her head down and do her job without drawing any attention to herself. The other servers had warned her, and now she understood why. Ethan William wasn't just a man who'd lost his wife. He was a man who had lost his humanity, and he wore his cruelty like armor, cutting down anyone who got too close. But no matter how hard the nights were, Ella came back. Michael needed her too much. Every shift, Every tray of champagne she served was another small step toward a better future for him. She dreamed of sending him to a good school, of giving him the chances she never had. Her own life had taken a detour when she'd gotten pregnant at 17. The boy she thought she'd spend her life with had gone off to college, leaving her behind with nothing but broken promises and a baby to raise alone. She hadn't finished high school, hadn't even had time to grieve for the future she lost. Instead, she worked day and night, hustling to make sure Michael never went without. This job, as degrading as it could be, was just another stop along the way. She couldn't afford pride when there was rent to pay, and Michael needed new shoes again. So she kept her head down and her focus on the prize. A better life for her son, no matter what it cost her. As the party carried on, Ella resumed her role as an invisible figure moving through the crowd unnoticed, but the weight of Ethan's words stayed with her. She couldn't forget them, not the cruelty in his tone, nor the way he'd looked at her like she was beneath him. The evening was more extravagant than usual, even by Ethan Williams' standards. Guests drifted through the mansion's grand hall, their conversations layered over the hum of live music, while a cascade of flowers decorated every corner. The party was meant to impress, and it did. But beneath the glittering surface of perfection, a current of something darker brooded, at least in the host's eyes. Ethan's mood had soured before the first guest arrived. Restless energy gripped him, amplified by the constant ache of loneliness he refused to acknowledge. He had grown accustomed to wearing his arrogance like a second skin, using it to push people away, to remind them of their place and of his. The guests at his parties were nothing more than accessories, placeholders for the life he used to know. The laughter and the clinking glasses, the endless compliments and admiration. They were all hollow, and tonight it grated on him more than ever. Ella moved through the party like a shadow, her steps measured and deliberate, expertly avoiding attention. She had mastered the art of invisibility at these events, yet there was no way to forget that in this mansion, she didn't belong. It wasn't just about the wealth that separated her from these people, but the ease with which they floated through life. Her existence was about survival, about making it to the next payday, about hoping her son never felt the weight of her struggles. As she passed by the piano, its black lacquer shining under the soft lights, she allowed herself a brief glance. The memories of her childhood lessons, the music that used to fill her heart, rose unbidden to the surface. She hadn't touched a piano in years, hadn't let herself think about it. Life had taken her in a different direction, one she never anticipated. Yet for just a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to sit down and play again. "Still admiring it, are you?" The voice cut through her thoughts like a knife, cold and mocking. Her body stiffened immediately, the familiar dread creeping up her spine. She turned, forcing her expression into one of polite indifference as she faced Ethan. His eyes were sharper tonight, the whiskey in his hand only fueling the anger she could see simmering beneath his surface. Ella didn't know what had set him off, but she could tell something was different. His smile was a mask, one that didn't reach his eyes, and the way he looked at her, it wasn't casual, it was predatory. "I'm sorry, Mr. William," she said softly, her voice steady but guarded. She had learned her lesson the first time, after all. Never show weakness, never let him see how much his words stung. But Ethan wasn't interested in an apology. In fact, he barely acknowledged it. Instead, he tilted his head as if appraising her. "You've been working these parties for quite some time now, haven't you, Ella?" She swallowed, nodding slightly. "Yes, sir." "And yet, you've never really had the chance to enjoy them. Always working, always serving. How dull that must be." The way he said it made her skin prickle. This wasn't a compliment. This was a trap. She knew better than to rise to it, but she had no idea where this was going. "You deserve a little fun, don't you?" His tone was light, almost conversational, but it made her stomach churn. "In fact, I've been thinking. I have a birthday coming up next weekend. It's going to be quite the event. Why don't you come as my guest, of course, and bring your son? It will be a nice change of pace for you." The world seemed to freeze around her. Ella felt the weight of his words sink in, every part of her screaming to run, to refuse. This was no genuine invitation. There was no kindness in his offer. But what could she say? She couldn't afford to offend him, not with how much she relied on this job. And there was Michael. He knew about Michael. He was using him to corner her. Ethan saw the hesitation in her eyes and leaned in slightly, his smile widening. "Come now, Ella. It'll be fun. You've worked so hard. Let me repay you. I insist." The charm in his voice was as false as the warmth in his eyes, and Ella knew it. But she also knew she had no choice. Refusing him might mean losing this job, and she couldn't risk that, not for her son's sake. So she did the only thing she could. I'd be honored," she said quietly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Thank you for the invitation." "Wonderful," he said, straightening up, clearly pleased with himself. "I'll make sure the staff sends you all the details, and do bring your son. I'd love to meet him." With that, Ethan turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd, leaving Ella standing alone, her hands shaking slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her, but it was no use. She knew deep down that this was no simple invitation. He had something planned, something cruel, and now she was trapped. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Ella went through the motions, serving drinks and smiling when necessary, but her mind was somewhere else, replaying the conversation with Ethan over and over again. What did he want? Why had he singled her out like this? Her instincts told her it wasn't good. Nothing about it felt good. When she finally got home that night, Michael was already asleep, his small body curled up under the worn blanket on his bed. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, her heart aching. How could she protect him from this? How could she shield him from the world when she was barely holding it together herself? As she sat down at the kitchen table, the silence of the small apartment closing in around her, she felt the weight of Ethan's invitations settle over her like a heavy cloak. Next weekend she would step into his world as a guest, not a server. But she knew in her bones that it would be anything but a pleasant evening. Ella stood outside the towering gates of Ethan Williams' mansion, gripping Michael's small hand as they waited for the valet to open the heavy iron barrier. Her son, usually full of energy and curiosity, was uncharacteristically quiet, wide-eyed, as he took in the sheer grandeur of the estate. Ella's nerves felt like they were tied in knots, every part of her screaming that she didn't belong here. But she dressed as well as she could, wearing a simple dress that had seen its fair share of wear and making sure Michael's shirt and trousers were clean and neatly pressed. Still, no matter how hard she tried, she knew they'd stand out like sore thumbs among the polished guests. The doors to the mansion opened, and the opulence hit them like a wave. Ella held her breath, forcing herself to walk forward as if she wasn't silently praying for a quick exit. As they stepped into the foyer, she could feel the stares, curious, appraising, but not cruel. The guests weren't openly rude, but their indifference was palpable. These people lived in a world far removed from hers, where life was measured by wealth and status, and in this world, Ella and Michael were invisible. "Mom, this place is huge," Michael whispered, his eyes darting from the crystal chandeliers to the rich tapestries lining the walls, his voice filled with innocent wonder, momentarily calming Ella's anxiety. "It is," she murmured, squeezing his hand gently. "Just stay close, okay?" They navigated through the elegantly dressed guests who barely glanced in their direction, their conversations flowing as though nothing could interrupt the perfection of the evening. Servers moved around effortlessly, trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres balanced with expert grace. Ella had worked these events herself countless times, but being on the other side now as a guest felt foreign, even wrong. She didn't belong and she knew it. She could feel it in the way the room's energy subtly shifted every time she and Michael stepped into view. She caught sight of Ethan across the room, his presence commanding as always. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his posture as relaxed as if he were a king surveying his court. His gaze moved lazily over the crowd before it settled on Ella. The moment their eyes met, her stomach twisted into an uncomfortable knot. He smiled, a slow, calculated curve of his lips that sent a shiver down her spine. She knew that smile. It wasn't kind, and it wasn't casual. There was something else lurking behind it, something far less benign. Before she could look away, he raised his glass in a silent toast to her. She forced a thin smile in return, her heartbeat quickening. There was no mistaking it. Tonight was going to be a game, and she was his pawn. The evening dragged on, the air thick with the scent of perfume and expensive cologne. Ella and Michael stayed near the edges of the room, as inconspicuous as possible. She watched as the guests laughed easily, sipping their drinks and exchanging small talk that meant nothing. Every so often, Michael would tug at her hand, his curiosity about the mansion evident, but she could see how overwhelmed he was too. He, like her, didn't belong in this world. Then, as if on cue, the music stopped. Ella's breath hitched as Ethan made his way to the front of the room, commanding the attention of the crowd with nothing more than his presence. The guests turned toward him, falling silent as he raised his hand for attention. He stood tall, the embodiment of wealth and power, and Ella felt the weight of his gaze land on her once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice smooth, oozing the kind of charisma that once drew people to him effortlessly. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with me tonight. It's always a pleasure to host such fine company." The room buzzed with polite applause, and Ella swallowed hard. She had a terrible feeling about where this was going. Ethan's eyes gleamed with something dark as he continued. "This evening we have a very special guest with us. Someone who has shown such interest in the finer things in life, particularly my wife's beloved piano." Ella's stomach dropped, her blood running cold as every head in the room turned toward her. She could feel her pulse in her throat as Ethan's gaze remained locked on hers, his words dripping with mockery. The humiliation was slow, deliberate. "I'd like to introduce Ella, one of our hard-working servers," he said, his smile widening as the attention of the crowd focused entirely on her. "She's always had such a fondness for the piano, and tonight I thought we'd give her the opportunity to share that with all of you. So Ella," he gestured grandly toward the grand piano in the corner of the room, "why don't you show us what you've got?" The air in the room shifted. There was no laughter, no outright cruelty from the guests. But there was a tension, a charged silence as everyone waited to see what she would do. Ella's heart pounded in her chest, her mouth dry. She wanted to disappear, to vanish from the room entirely. But Michael was standing right there, his hand in hers, looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't realize that this was all a cruel joke at her expense. For him, she had to be strong. She had to push down the humiliation, the anger. If she faltered, if she showed her fear, Michael would sense it, and that was something she couldn't allow. So she did the only thing she could think of. She straightened her spine, took a deep breath, and nodded. "I'd love to," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The room buzzed with surprise as she walked toward the piano, her steps steady though her heart was anything but. Ella's heart raced as she lowered herself onto the piano bench, her fingers hovering above the polished ivory keys for a moment. The weight of the room pressed down on her like a tidal wave, the murmur of curious whispers from the crowd, the piercing gaze of Ethan as he watched her like a predator waiting for her to stumble. It all threatened to drown her in humiliation. Her chest tightened and her fingers trembled. She hadn't played in years, not since before Michael was born. What was she thinking? How had she let herself be trapped into this? But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Michael. He stood a few feet away, his eyes wide and hopeful, his little hands clenched in excitement. He didn't understand the mockery surrounding them. All he saw was his mother about to do something special, something magical. For him, this moment wasn't a humiliation. It was a triumph, a chance to see her in a way he'd never seen before. It was for him that she took a deep breath and straightened her back, forcing the tension out of her shoulders. She couldn't let him see her break. If she faltered now, he would carry the shame too, and that wasn't something she could live with. So she closed her eyes and let the music find her. She pressed down on the first key, the sound soft but steady, as if calling her back to a different time. The music, though tentative at first, came to life beneath her hands, each note resonating through her like a long-lost memory. Her fingers were stiff, unpracticed, but they remembered enough. The familiar rhythm began to flow, and before long her hesitation faded. She closed her eyes and let herself sink into the melody. The music, Chopin, a piece she had loved as a child, wrapped itself around her, the soft, aching notes filling the vast room. The crowd, which had been buzzing with murmurs just moments before, fell silent. The harsh glares and cold stares began to blur, fading into the background until all that existed was the piano and the music and the rhythm that carried her away from this world and into another. With each passing moment, her fingers moved more freely, more confidently, and the years of absence melted away. She was no longer the tired, overworked server struggling to make ends meet. She was the girl who had once sat at her family's small old piano, getting lost in the same music that had offered her solace all those years ago. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Let the music take you where it wants to go, Ella. Don't think about it. Feel it." And she did. She let the music guide her, feeling her way through the notes like an old friend she hadn't seen in years, but still knew by heart. Her hands moved gracefully across the keys, the once rusty movements now fluid, almost effortless. She was playing with everything she had, her past, her present, and the hope for a future that might be more than this. The first piece ended, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. Silence. Then a ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, but growing steadily. She could hear it, but didn't fully process it. She was still lost in the music. The applause didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling surging through her. Without thinking, she launched into a second piece, one even more challenging than the first, a more dramatic, passionate piece by Beethoven. Her heart raced as she hit the opening chords, her hands moving with newfound confidence, surprising even herself with how naturally it all returned. She felt her pulse quicken with the rise and fall of the music, her breath catching as she poured every bit of herself into the performance. The notes swelled, filling the cavernous space with their haunting, powerful melody. This wasn't just about playing the piano anymore. It was about reclaiming something she had long since lost. For too many years she had been weighed down by the struggle of survival, by the daily grind of making sure Michael had what he needed, by the weight of being forgotten, overlooked. But here, in this moment, she was more than that. She was something bigger, something brighter, and for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. By the time the final notes hung in the air, trembling in the room, Ella felt like she had traveled 1,000 miles. She opened her eyes, her fingers resting on the keys, the music still lingering in her ears. She looked up, unsure of what she would see. For a moment, the room was utterly still. She turned her head slightly and saw Michael. His face lit up in a grin so wide it made her heart ache. In that instant, all the fear, all the humiliation she'd anticipated, disappeared. Then, almost like a wave building slowly, the applause came. It wasn't polite or scattered. It was thunderous, genuine. People stood clapping, some with wide smiles of disbelief, others with expressions of quiet admiration. Ella blinked, dazed. She hadn't expected this. She'd braced herself for the laughter, the sneers, for Ethan's cruel smile of satisfaction. But there was none of that. The crowd wasn't mocking her. They were applauding her. She finally dared to look around, blinking into the bright lights and the sea of faces. People were smiling, nodding, whispering to one another with astonishment. Some were even wiping their eyes, moved by the emotion and the music she had just played. Her heart pounded, disbelief flooding through her. But when she looked past the crowd, past the sea of faces, she found Ethan standing near the back, his expression unreadable. His usual cool demeanor was gone, replaced by something Ella couldn't quite name. He wasn't clapping, but he also wasn't smiling. If anything, he looked shaken, like someone had just pulled the rug out from under him. He wasn't even moving. He stood perfectly still, his face pale, his eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. Ella couldn't tell if it was shock, disbelief, or something more complex, but he was utterly unprepared for what he had just witnessed. Then, Without changing his expression or saying anything, he simply turned around and disappeared up the stairs towards his room. He was not seen again that evening, but before she could fully register his reaction, the crowd surged forward, people coming up to her, shaking her hand, complimenting her. "That was extraordinary," someone exclaimed. "Where did you learn to play like that?" another asked, their tone filled with awe. Ella tried to respond graciously, offering soft smiles and nodding, but the room was spinning around her, the attention overwhelming. She had been a shadow among these people for so long, unseen and unnoticed, and now in an instant, they were all looking at her as if she were a star. She stood from the piano, instinctively searching for Michael, who had moved closer to her, his hand reaching up for hers. She took it, drawing strength from his small, steady grip. No matter how surreal the moment felt, no matter how much praise was suddenly being heaped on her, all that really mattered was the look in her son's eyes. The party resumed around her, the guests gradually turning back to their conversations, but the atmosphere had shifted. Ella stood from the piano, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted too. "I think it's time we go, sweetie," she whispered to Michael, who nodded eagerly. He was excited, but also tired, and she knew that leaving now, before anything could spoil the evening, was the right choice. But as they reached the car, something shifted inside her. That triumph was tinged with an undercurrent of unease. Ethan wasn't the type to let something like this go. He wasn't a man who liked being blindsided, and he certainly wasn't a man who would take kindly to being shown up at his own party. She didn't know what would come next, but she was certain that this wasn't the last she would hear of it. As the car drove away from the mansion, the distant hum of the party fading into the background, Ella couldn't shake the strange mixture of feelings swirling inside her. She had given it her all, shown her talent in a way she hadn't in years, and yet a part of her still felt as though she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Michael, now nestled in his seat beside her, broke the silence. "Mom, you were amazing," he said, his voice soft but full of wonder. "I didn't know you could do that." Ella smiled down at him, her heart swelling with love and relief. "I didn't either," she admitted quietly. They arrived home, the weight of the evening still heavy on her shoulders. She tucked Michael into bed, kissed his forehead, and whispered goodnight. As she finally sat down on the edge of her own bed, her mind raced with what had happened. The applause, the astonishment, the way people had looked at her. It all seemed like a dream, but there was no escaping the truth. Ethan's reaction was the one that lingered the most. It was his face, pale and haunted, that stayed with her as she lay in the dark. Ethan William had been shaken, and Ella had no idea what that might mean for her future. It had been a few days since the party, but the weight of it still lingered on Ella's shoulders. The memory of the applause, Michael's bright smile, and the way Ethan had looked at her afterward haunted her as she went about her daily routines. She had tried to push it all to the back of her mind, returning to her regular jobs and focusing on keeping life as normal as possible for Michael. But it was impossible to forget that moment, the instant everything had shifted. She was washing dishes when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was an unfamiliar number. Ella frowned, drying her hands quickly on a dish towel before picking it up. The message on the screen was short, but it made her stomach drop. "Ella, this is Ethan William. I'd like to meet with you. Can we talk? Let me know when you're available." Her heart started pounding immediately. The last thing she wanted was to be dragged back into his orbit. She had been expecting some kind of fallout after the party, some kind of retaliation for her unexpected performance. Now it seemed it was coming. The anxiety that had been quietly simmering ever since that night came rushing back in full force. Why did he want to see her? To berate her for stealing the spotlight at his party? To fire her from any future catering gigs? The possibilities ran through her mind in a chaotic swirl, none of them good. She took a breath and set the phone down, walking to the window to stare out at the city street. A part of her wanted to ignore the message altogether, to pretend she hadn't seen it, but the logical side of her knew that wasn't an option. Whatever Ethan wanted, she had to face it head on. Running away wasn't something she could afford to do, not with Michael depending on her. And maybe, just maybe, this was something else, something she couldn't yet see. With reluctance, she typed back a response. "I'm available tomorrow afternoon. Where would you like to meet?" The reply came almost immediately, giving her a location, a quiet cafe on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place she had expected Ethan William to suggest. Too casual, too far from the glittering parties and fancy restaurants he usually frequented. That alone sent a ripple of uncertainty through her. The next day, Ella arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, her nerves in knots. She had chosen a simple outfit, something that wouldn't stand out but still looked presentable. She felt out of place as she walked into the cozy space, its warm, intimate atmosphere a stark contrast to the tension buzzing inside her. Ethan was already there, sitting at a table by the window. He looked different. No suit, no crisp perfection. Instead, he was dressed in a soft sweater and jeans, his hair slightly tousled, as if he hadn't spent hours preparing himself for this meeting. He looked human, tired, maybe even vulnerable. It was the first time she had seen him without the armor he usually wore, and it caught her off guard. He stood when she approached, a faint smile on his face. "Ella, thank you for coming." She nodded, unsure of how to respond. The unease was still there, but something about his demeanor, the softness in his tone, made her hesitate. They sat across from each other, the silence stretching for a moment before Ethan cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the table. "I've been thinking a lot about the other night," he said, his voice low. "About what happened and about what I did." Ella stayed quiet, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for him to continue. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. Ethan looked up at her, and the expression on his face wasn't one she had ever seen before. It wasn't arrogance or indifference. It was something far more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. I was cruel to you, and I knew it. I had every intention of humiliating you in front of everyone that night." Ella's heart raced, her fingers clenching in her lap. She had known it, but hearing him admit it made the anger she'd pushed down bubble to the surface. She bit her lip, forcing herself to stay calm, but he continued. "Your music, it reminded me of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It reminded me of my wife, of who I was when she was still alive. I didn't realize how much I'd changed until that moment." He looked out the window, his eyes distant. "Evelyn used to play that piano every evening, the same way you did. It was her escape, her joy. I'd sit and listen, and everything felt right. But after she died, I shut all of that away. I became someone I don't recognize anymore." Ethan's voice softened, almost breaking. "When you played, it brought her back to me, not just the memory of her, but the memory of who I used to be. I'm not proud of the man I've become, Ella, and I realize now that I've taken that out on everyone around me." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this raw honesty, this admission of guilt. For so long she had seen Ethan as nothing more than the bitter, arrogant man who threw parties to mask his misery. But now, sitting across from him, she saw a man who had been broken by grief and didn't know how to find his way back. "I don't know how to fix everything I've done," he said quietly, his eyes locking with hers. "But I know I need to start somewhere, and I need to start by apologizing to you." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. The anger she had carried with her melted just a little, replaced by a flicker of something else. Compassion, maybe. It was hard to hold on to her resentment when she could see how much he was struggling with his own demons. I appreciate the apology," Ella said, her voice soft but steady. The cafe seemed quieter after Ethan's apology, as if the world outside had paused, giving space for the weight of his words to settle between them. Ella sipped her coffee, still processing the unexpected vulnerability she had just witnessed. She hadn't come here expecting an apology, let alone one that felt so sincere, but now, as she looked at him, this man who had once humiliated her, now humbled before her, she found herself at a loss for words. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, his voice softer now, "about what you did at the party. How you played, the way you brought the room to life. It was something I haven't seen in a long time. Not since Evelyn." Ella's eyes flickered with curiosity. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "Hosting these parties used to mean something to me," Ethan admitted, running a hand through his hair. "They were about bringing people together, sharing moments, not just about wealth and appearances. But I lost that. I've been using these parties to hide behind the champagne, the laughter, the extravagance. It's all felt empty." He looked down at his hands, almost as if ashamed of the truth he was speaking. "But that night, when you played, something shifted. I saw the way people responded to you, Ella. They weren't there for the party anymore. They were there for the music, for what you gave them." Ella stared at him, unsure of how to respond. She remembered the applause, the way people had come up to her afterward, complimenting her performance. But she hadn't seen it the way he had. She had been too focused on escaping the situation without falling apart. Ethan continued, his voice taking on a more deliberate tone. "I want to bring that back to my parties, the real meaning behind them. I want to stop hiding behind all the glitz and start making these events meaningful again. And I think you can help me do that." Her heart skipped a beat, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. "I don't understand," she said cautiously, wary of where this was heading. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "I'd like you to become the regular pianist at my parties, Ella. No more serving drinks, no more fading into the background. I want you to be the highlight, the one people come to see and hear. I know it's a lot to ask, and after everything that happened, you have every reason to say no. But I think this could be something really special." The words hung in the air between them, the offer both tempting and terrifying. Ella felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Being a server at Ethan's parties was something she had grown accustomed to, a job that paid the bills even if it chipped away at her dignity some nights. But this, becoming a regular pianist, stepping into the spotlight in a way she never thought possible, it was too much, too soon. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaky. "I haven't played in years, not professionally. What if I fail? What if people don't like it?" Ethan smiled gently, the kind of smile that lacked its usual sharpness. "You won't fail. You've already proven you can do this. And if it doesn't work out, you can go back to being a server, no harm done. But trust me, the way people responded to you last time, they'll love you, and the pay will be better. Much better." Ella felt her heart pound. She could picture Michael's face, how he looked so proud of her at the party. This could change things for them, give them more security, maybe even a future she hadn't dared to imagine. And yet, the fear of stepping into the unknown still gripped her. "What do you say?" Ethan asked quietly, his eyes searching hers for an answer. She hesitated for a long moment, her mind racing. But something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the memory of that night, the music flowing through her, or the way Michael had smiled up at her afterward. Maybe it was the thought of doing something she loved again, of making music a part of her life in a way that it hadn't been for years. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it. I'll play." Ethan let out a breath, as if relieved. "You won't regret it. I promise you that." The first party with Ella as the featured pianist was a modest affair, at least by Ethan's usual standards. She had been nervous the entire day, her stomach turning as she prepared. Her fingers, although still nimble, hadn't performed in front of an audience since that fateful night. But when the time came, she took her place at the piano, her hands poised above the keys, and let the music carry her away once more. To her surprise, the audience responded just as they had before. The applause was warm and genuine, the tips generous, far more than she had ever received as a server. With each performance, her confidence grew. Party after party, she became a regular fixture, a part of Ethan's events that guests began to expect. They asked for specific pieces, classical and modern, sometimes even jokingly requesting a pop song, to see if she could play it with the same grace. She obliged, often surprising herself with how much she enjoyed it. The parties began to take on a different tone, a subtle but important shift from mere showmanship to something more authentic. What started as a tentative experiment quickly turned into something far more than she had anticipated. The way her playing brought something more to the evening than anyone had expected. People were so moved that some of them gave her generous tips and even notes of appreciation, small tokens of gratitude that she found tucked among the crisp currency. The shift in Ethan's parties didn't happen all at once. At first, it was subtle, fewer opulent displays, more intimate conversations. The guests, many of whom had once come solely to bask in the excess, began to notice the change, though it didn't bother them. If anything, they seemed intrigued. The music, Ella's music, became the centerpiece of the evening. She wasn't just playing in the background. She was setting the tone, creating a warmth that had long been absent from Ethan's events. Gone were the shallow displays of wealth, the ostentatious decorations, and the endless flowing champagne meant to impress. Instead, Ethan's mansion transformed into a place where people gathered for something more meaningful. The parties, once celebrations of extravagance, now had purpose: fundraisers for local charities, support for community causes, and events that helped those in need became the new normal. The guests still enjoyed themselves, of course, but the energy had shifted. There was depth now, something tangible in the air that hadn't existed before. The success of each party was measured not by the wealth on display, but by the amount of money raised for the causes they supported. Ethan had thrown his heart into the change, determined to do more than just atone for his past. It wasn't about redemption, not anymore. It was about transformation. These parties were no longer about him or his wealth. They had become about the world outside, about giving back. And the guests, once there only to show off their connections, embraced this new purpose wholeheartedly. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser for a local children's hospital, Ethan found Ella at the piano, her fingers still gently resting on the keys after her final piece. The guests were lingering, some thanking her for the evening's performance, but most had already left, leaving a quiet hum in the air. Ethan approached her with a glass of wine in hand, a rare gesture of casual camaraderie between them. "You're incredible, you know that," he said, leaning against the piano, his tone light but sincere. Ella smiled, still feeling the warmth of the evening's success. "Thank you. I'm just happy to be here." He looked at her for a moment, studying her with a kind of contemplative expression that made her heart skip. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his voice dropping slightly. "You've been doing this for a while now, and it's obvious how much people love you. But I don't want this to just be a job for you, Ella. I know how much music means to you." She met his gaze, unsure of where he was going with this. She had grown comfortable in her role, had found a rhythm in playing at the parties, but she hadn't expected anything beyond that. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "I see the passion you have for music, but I know you didn't get the chance to pursue that fully before life got in the way. I want to help you," Ethan said, his voice soft but resolute. "I've already spoken to a few people at the conservatory in town, and they'd be happy to take you on. I'd like to pay for your tuition so you can go back to school and study music properly, the way you were meant to." For a moment, Ella couldn't speak. Her dreams of playing, of studying music, had been put on hold when Michael came into her life. She had never regretted it. Michael was everything to her, but there had always been that quiet ache, the one she tried to ignore. "Ethan, Her voice broke off as the enormity of it hit her. That's too much." He shook his head gently. "No, it's not. It's the least I can do. You've given me more than you realize. You've brought life back into this house, into these events. You've helped me remember what it feels like to care about something again. I want you to have the chance to follow your dreams, Ella. And if this is a way I can help, then let me." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to show how deeply his words affected her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I never thought I mean, going back to school, it wasn't even something I let myself hope for." Ethan smiled, that quiet, genuine smile she had come to recognize as his new self. "Say yes," he said simply. "You've earned this." For a long moment, Ella sat in silence, her heart torn between disbelief and gratitude. But as she looked at Ethan, saw the sincerity in his eyes, the way he had transformed from the man who had once tried to tear her down to someone who genuinely wanted to lift her up, she knew the answer. She had spent too many years surviving, too many years putting her own dreams on hold. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'll do it." The conservatory felt like a second chance at a life Ella had long ago abandoned, not by choice, but by circumstance. Walking through its grand doors for the first time, she felt a flood of emotions: excitement, fear, and most of all, disbelief that she was actually here. It was real now. Ethan's generous offer had opened a door she thought would remain closed forever. But stepping through it wasn't just about her. It was for Michael, too. She wanted to show him that dreams didn't die, even if they were delayed. Her days quickly became a whirlwind between Michael, her studies, and her continued performances at Ethan's now charitable and purpose-filled parties. Ella barely had time to catch her breath, but for the first time in a long time, the exhaustion she felt was good. It was the kind of tired that came from doing something that mattered, something that filled her with purpose and joy. The conservatory was a world away from anything she had ever experienced. Most of her fellow students were young, fresh out of high school with years of uninterrupted practice under their belts. Many of them came from well-off families, with their paths laid out for them in a way Ella had never known. She felt the sting of self-doubt when she compared herself to them, a single mother in her 30s who had taken a detour no one else in that room had. But as the weeks passed, she found her footing. Her professors were welcoming and impressed by her raw talent and her dedication. The years away from formal practice hadn't dulled her passion, and her experiences, her struggles, her resilience, gave her music a depth that few could match. She brought something different to the conservatory, something that couldn't be learned through technique alone. Juggling it all was a challenge. Michael was in school during the day, but her evenings were packed with rehearsals, lessons, and homework. She would pick him up from aftercare, race home to prepare dinner, and then, once he was in bed, sit at the kitchen table to review sheet music or study the theory she had long forgotten. Some nights she was so tired her hands shook as they moved across the piano keys, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that she was building something better for them both. Michael, now 7, was her biggest fan. He sat beside her as she practiced at home, his bright eyes following her hands, sometimes humming along to the music. Watching her, he began to develop a fascination with the piano. It wasn't long before he started asking questions about how to play. "Can you teach me, Mom?" he asked one evening, his small hands tapping the table in an imitation of the way she played. Ella looked at him, her heart swelling. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll start with something simple. You'll be playing like me in no time." They began with the basics, scales and simple melodies. Michael took to it quickly, his excitement infectious. Ella found that teaching him reignited her own love for the music in a new way. It wasn't just about performing anymore. It was about sharing something beautiful with her son. The piano became a part of their routine. Every evening after dinner, Michael would sit beside her, his little fingers pressing the keys with concentration and determination. He had the same spark in his eyes that she had once had as a child, the same awe at the magic of making music come alive. And as he practiced, Ella couldn't help but wonder if this was what their lives could have been all along, if things had been different. But she didn't dwell on that. What mattered was that they were here now, creating a future she hadn't thought possible. Her performances at Ethan's parties continued, but now they had an added layer. Guests who had come to know her through his events began asking her to play at other gatherings, small, intimate weddings, charity galas, and corporate events where music was more than background noise. It became a way for her to make additional income, something she hadn't anticipated but was deeply grateful for. The connections she made through Ethan's guests turned into steady work, and soon she was performing at events outside of his sphere, building a reputation of her own. But no matter how busy her schedule became, Ella always made time for Michael. His love for the piano grew with each passing day, and soon it wasn't just about lessons with his mom. He asked to take formal lessons, and Ella couldn't have been prouder. The little boy who had once sat at her feet watching her with wide eyes was now determined to follow in her footsteps. Ethan noticed the shift in their lives too. At one of his parties, he approached her between sets, a rare, quiet moment in the chaos of the evening. "I hear you're becoming quite the sought-after musician these days," he said with a grin, handing her a glass of water. Ella smiled, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I never expected any of this. It's more than I ever thought possible." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, looking out over the guests who were enjoying the evening, many of them having donated to the night's charity cause. "You deserve it. And Michael? How's he doing with his lessons?" Her heart swelled at the mention of her son. "He's doing great. He loves it. I've signed him up for formal lessons now, and he's already better than I was at his age." Ethan chuckled softly. "No surprise there. He's got a great teacher." Ella laughed, shaking her head. "I'm just trying to keep up with him. He's got the same fire I had, maybe more." There was a beat of silence, comfortable and familiar. Ethan turned to her, his expression more serious now. "You've worked so hard for all of this, Ella. You've built something incredible, not just for yourself but for Michael, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you." The words took her by surprise. She had never imagined hearing those words from Ethan William, the man who had once seen her as nothing more than another servant in his mansion. But now, standing here with so much behind them, and even more ahead, she realized how far they had both come. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan waved the sentiment away with a modest smile. "You could have. You would have. I just gave you a little nudge. The rest, you did all that yourself." The sunlight poured through the wide windows of the music studio, warming the polished floors as the soft hum of children's voices filled the room. Ella sat at the piano, guiding a small group of students through the first steps of reading music. Their tiny fingers stumbled over the keys, but their eyes were wide with excitement, and she couldn't help but smile at their determination. This was her life now, a life she had once only dreamed of, now realized in the most unexpected way. After completing her studies at the conservatory, she had been offered a teaching position. It wasn't just about playing anymore. It was about sharing her love for music with a new generation, watching young faces light up as they discovered the magic that lived within each note. Her students came from all walks of life. Some were the children of her old neighbors, from families who never thought they'd have the chance to give their kids piano lessons. Others came from wealthier backgrounds, drawn to Ella's reputation after hearing her at Ethan's events. It didn't matter where they came from. When they sat at the piano, they were all the same, filled with the same wonder, the same hope. Music had a way of breaking down barriers like that. Ella found herself thriving in her new role. The years of struggle and sacrifice had given her more than just strength. They had given her a depth of understanding that made her an extraordinary teacher. She knew what it felt like to dream and be forced to put those dreams aside. She knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself, and now she was determined to help these children hold on to their dreams, to show them that anything was possible with passion and perseverance. Her son Michael was growing into a fine young musician himself. Now 10 years old, he had developed his own love for the piano, and his talent had blossomed under Ella's careful guidance. His lessons had become more advanced, and while he still practiced with his mother, he was beginning to develop his own style, his own voice. Ella watched him with pride, knowing that her journey had inspired him to carve out his own path. At home, their small apartment was still modest, but it was filled with music and laughter. The struggles of the past were still a part of their story, but they no longer weighed Ella down. She had learned to move forward, to let her successes and joy fill the spaces that hardship had once occupied. Ethan, too, had changed. His mansion, once a cold fortress of wealth and isolation, had transformed into something entirely different. The parties he hosted were no longer about flaunting riches or status. They had become a hub for charity work, for community, and for people who wanted to make a difference. Each event had a purpose, raising funds for causes close to his heart. He had thrown his energy into giving back, using his resources to support organizations that helped underprivileged children, funded music programs in schools, and provided scholarships to young artists. One evening, Ethan hosted a particularly special event, a benefit concert for a new music school that was being built for underprivileged children. Ella took her place at the grand piano, the one she had once admired from afar, now hers to command with grace and certainty. The guests settled into their seats, the hum of excitement filling the room. But tonight she wasn't playing alone. Michael stood beside her, his hands hovering above the keys. This wasn't just her moment, it was theirs. The little boy who had once watched her with wide eyes, who had seen her rise from the shadows, was now ready to stand with her, his talent a reflection of the love and dedication she had poured into him. When the final note faded into the air, the room erupted in applause, louder and more heartfelt than anything Ella had ever heard. Ella stood from the piano, taking Michael's hand as they bowed together. Mother and son, partners in a life that had come full circle. The applause echoed around them, but all she could feel was the fullness in her heart, the sense that they had made it, that they were exactly where they were meant to be,